Good day. Last couple of weeks and months have seen a cascade of news and information about Russian air defense and anti-missile developments. The first news, which at least I came across, was in the summer, and it concerned the somewhat enigmatic Peresvet laser system, which is one of those new military systems announced by President Putin in a speech which he gave in 2018. This has always been the system that there's been the greatest degree of uncertainty about, and there is still a great deal of speculation about what it exactly is and what it does. What we can now say is that it does appear to be in operational service, and it is, interestingly enough, being deployed alongside Topol intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are also, by the way, road-mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles. In other words, these Peresvet laser systems, which are themselves, incidentally, road-mobile, appear to be used in some form in combination with the Topol road-mobile ICBMs. The assumption is that the Peresvet, which, as I said, is a system based on lasers, is intended to disrupt or perhaps even blind US reconnaissance satellites that are trying to keep track of the movement of Topol road mobile ICBMs. It's a plausible theory. Nobody's been able to confirm it or refute it one way or the other, at least not in any open source that I have seen. But the fact that this system is being deployed alongside the Topol is itself suggestive, and it does presumably indicate some sort of defense system to protect the Topol, perhaps from a US strike, by preventing the US being able to track where those Topol missiles are being deployed or what they're doing. If so, then the Peresvet is a space weapon of a certain sort directed against US satellites. Then we received, shortly after, a few weeks ago, further news that the much discussed and much touted S-500 Prometei surface-to-air missile system is now being deployed for the first time to military units around Moscow. Now, this has come with information that though the S-500 is now indeed in service, this is still a deployment which is intended to iron out any teething problems with the system and to familiarize the troops who will be operating it with how the system works, and also to see and assess any problems in the system's operation. So it looks as if major deployment of the S-500 may be perhaps a year or perhaps even 2 years away, but at least it is now entering service, and the Russian Defense Ministry has provided film of this system. Then, directly after news that the S-500 had entered deployment, we learnt that an entirely new system, one never mentioned by the Russians before, the S-550, is now also in advanced development, with the Russians talking about its deployment in 2024 or 2025. And this is what the Russian news agency, the official Russian news agency TASS, has to say about the S-550 system. This is a system which had never been mentioned before by the Russians or indeed by the US. And this is what the Russians say. This is what TASS says. Russia's latest 550 missile systems will serve as a mobile follow-up of the A-135 Amur and A-235 Nudol, strategic missile defense systems and will feature the kinetic energy interceptor principle to avoid a nuclear detonation when a warhead is struck. Military expert Dmitry Litovkin told TASS. In the case of Soviet anti-ballistic missile systems, nuclear warheads were intended to be intercepted over the country's central industrial region by a counterblast. It was believed that both dummy targets and warheads would burn up in the emerging plasma. Therefore, the nuclear ash would all the same fall down on the country's territory. The S-550, to follow the logic, will employ a different principle, a kinetic intercept. This will make it possible to physically destroy the warhead and prevent nuclear blasts. In the case that a warhead is destroyed, its fragments will create a radioactive background, albeit to a lesser degree compared to a shell explosion. The latest S-550 system may therefore serve as a follow-up of the A-135 Amur and A-235 Nudol strategic missile systems in its mobile configuration. And then he goes on to say, this is Mr. Litovkin, I presume that it will become an extra element of the S-500 Prometei system. It was earlier announced that this system would be able to shoot down both ballistic nuclear warheads and low Earth orbit satellites. Judging by everything, the military has made a decision to divide these functions between the two systems. The multitask option is not always good for a combat system, hence a conclusion that the S-550 will serve as a follow-up to the A-135 Amur and the A-235 Nudol strategic defense systems, but in a mobile configuration. So that's the view of Mr. Litovkin. And then we have TASS. They've actually spoken to someone in the defense ministry, Russia's defense ministry, and this person has told TASS that the first S-550 strategic missile defense system would enter service with the Russian army by 2025. He said that the hardware for the S-550 had already been built and related to the strategic ballistic missile defense system operated by Russia. The S-550 would use a mobile launcher with a hypersonic missile, and no seaborne version of this weapon was envisaged. And Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said at a ministry conference call on November 9th that President Putin had put emphasis on the importance of delivering S-350, that's an anti-aircraft system, S-500 and S-550 air and missile defense systems to the Russian troops. Now, I should say that there was an earlier system called the S-550, which was in development by the Soviet Union in the 1980s, and a certain amount of information is known about that. It was apparently intended to be a short-range system, a point defense system, but it was cancelled in 1988 at the time when the Soviet Union was starting to break up. So it doesn't seem as if this current S-550 is related to the Soviet-era S-550. Anyway, so much for the S-550, because after that we got further news, and this was the fact that an A-235 Nudol missile, which is another anti-ballistic missile system, the one which, according to Mr. Litovkin, the S-550 is supposed, Litovkin, the S-550 is supposed at some point to replace, that an A-235 Nudol launched from the Space Center at Plesetsk in northern Russia had shot down an old Soviet-era satellite, causing, by the way, a debris field, which caused a great deal of annoyance and anger in the United States. And this culminates, this is the culmination as I said, of a whole series of actions and moves by the Russians, showing off their new weapon systems and no doubt sending a message through the deployment of these systems to the United States. So what exactly is going on here? Well, I'm going to say straightforwardly that it looks to me as if the Russians are looking increasingly to match US developments, both in anti-ballistic missile systems and in space warfare systems. And they're doing that in the most public way, partly, no doubt, in order to match any American systems, or conceivably even to surpass them, but also, and perhaps more pertinently, to try to push the United States into a treaty on warfare in space, using space in terms of military systems, something which the United States has been consistently opposing. And here we come to an individual understanding of each one of these systems. Let's start with the Peresvet. As I said, it's a laser, and it's been deployed alongside top-hole ICBMs, and as I said, it appears to be intended to project a high-powered laser beam at a low-orbit satellite in order to blind or confuse the satellite so that it is not able to keep proper track of what the top-hole systems that the satellite is supposed to be trying to observe, what those mobile ICBMs are doing. And of course, if more of them are deployed, it's going to make it more and more difficult for US satellites in low Earth orbit to keep track of these top-hole systems effectively. And so it does look increasingly as if the Peresvet is indeed an anti-satellite system. And of course, what we've seen is that the A235 Nudol clearly does have an anti-satellite capability, and so it seems does the S-500, this new system that has entered service. In fact, there's been some discussion and speculation in some places about whether or not it was an S-500 missile system that shot down that Soviet-era satellite, or whether it was the A235 Nudol. It has in fact been confirmed that it was the A235 Nudol. So the Russians are going out of their way to say that they now have a very real capability to shoot down US satellites, or at least to blind them, as the case may be. Presumably in a conflict situation, a situation where there was a major crisis between the military superpowers, the Russians would use initially Peresvet systems to blind the American satellites. That would be presumably a temporary thing. I presume the satellite systems would recover from this. It would be a short-term thing. It would be something that would be extremely alarming to the United States, but it would not perhaps constitute a full-on escalation. It would still provide time and space for negotiations to take place in order to defuse a target. In the meantime, of course, whilst those satellites were blinded, the top-hole ICBMs would be able to deploy to their launch points without the United States being able to keep track of them, making it more difficult for the US to launch some kind of a strike, its own preemptive strike against these road mobile ICBMs. So that, it seems to me, is what the Peresvet is all about. It's to provide an initial response in a crisis, a really severe crisis. It's to blind temporarily those US satellites, enable those top-hole ICBMs to be deployed without the United States knowing where they are, but at the same time, it's a relatively non-aggressive step. It would hopefully allow time and space for negotiations. But then, of course, we have seen further steps taken. We have seen how the Nudol, the 8235 Nudol, which is always known, has an anti-satellite capability, how that has been used in a way that demonstrates to the United States that the Russians don't just have a capability to blind or to some extent disable satellites, they can actually destroy them. And it's important to say that when the Russians use missile systems to destroy satellites, they're not just acting to destroy one individual satellite. The debris field that is created as a result of the destruction of that particular satellite makes other activities in space much more difficult. And we have now an article about this in National Review, and it is quite interesting, even though National Review is a staunchly neocon magazine, and what it says should be taken with a strong pinch of salt. But it reads as follows. A war in space would be devastating for the American people, the military, and the US economy. Each of the over 1,500 pieces of new space debris created by, this is the latest Russian anti-satellite test, would be a huge hazard for satellites that enhance America's military advantages and provide critical services such as broadband internet, cell phone service, GPS, weather forecasting, satellite radio, and television to the US economy. Worse still, an adversary such as Russia or China first shot down a satellite in 2007, would probably be perfectly happy to deny space access both to themselves and to the United States in a conflict, as the United States military is far more reliant on space superiority to achieve its objectives than they are. Both near-peer powers have demonstrated the potential to shoot down satellites in a way that creates vast debris clouds in orbit of the type that would render space activities and the use of satellites in specific orbital ranges incredibly difficult for everyone. But that would be more of a loss for America. America's plans to win any potential conflict with the Russians are heavily dependent on space technology. America isn't able to defend Europe against the Russians, tank for tank and gun for gun, as the Russians have vastly more tanks than America's European allies. Instead, the US uses its space advantage to enhance the capabilities of small groups of American warfighters and our allies. For example, the F-35 relies heavily on space-based communication satellites to create the network-centric warfare effects that make it such a powerful tool in America's arsenal. The satellites that are now vulnerable to Russia are the same ones ensuring that America's precision weapons can pinpoint targets so accurately that strike errors are measured in inches. That advantage is reliant on our satellites. If Russia knocks out our reconnaissance satellites, the US military would be effectively blind. Without our communications satellites, we'd be deaf. Without our navigational satellites, we'd be unable to aim. The critical importance of space was obscured in recent conflicts, where the US fought against entities such as Saddam's Iraq or the Taliban, which had no counter-space capabilities. The current network of large US military and intelligence satellites does provide a major war-winning advantage over other countries, but it was built to operate in an uncontested environment. It simply isn't resilient to threats. Now, there is an awful lot in these comments which one can take strong issue with. Firstly, it's certainly true that the United States does heavily rely on satellites, much more, I suspect, than the Russians and the Chinese do in terms of war-fighting capabilities, but that perhaps also underestimates the extent to which the Russians and the Chinese also use satellites, not just in military technology terms, but in terms of their own economies. Also, these claims about some American systems might be a little exaggerated. To give an example, the F-35 fighter, there's been much written about it. I'm not in a position to say whether many of the criticisms that are made of it are correct or reasonable, but nonetheless, much has been written about it. It is indisputable that it does, however, depend heavily on satellites in order to carry out its various capabilities. And of course, it's true that the United States does rely heavily on communications satellites. However, in terms of communication satellites, in case of things like GPS, the Russians might not need and might not even plan to disrupt those satellites or the work of those satellites by using systems like the Nudol to create debris fields in lower space orbit. They're perhaps more likely, at least the Russians are perhaps more likely, to counter these systems with electronic warfare, with, in other words, exceptionally heavy jamming, which would make all of these systems potentially very vulnerable. There's been much talk and debate about Russian jamming capabilities. There seems to be a general consensus that they are extremely advanced indeed and very effective, and that it might be difficult for systems like the F-35 fighter jet to operate at full efficiency in the kind of very high jamming environment that the Russians might be intending. There is, however, another field where one might wonder whether anti-satellite systems, if they can work perhaps not just at lower Earth orbit, but at higher Earth orbits, might be useful to the Russians or indeed to other powers as well. The United States early warning satellites are a critical component of the US's defense and ability to keep track of Soviet and Chinese missile launches. And of course, if those satellites are disrupted or destroyed, and that might be a challenging thing to do, well, that would be an extremely difficult or troubling situation for the United States. Indeed, it might find that its ability to keep track of Russian and Chinese missile launches had become degraded. By contrast, the Russians and the Chinese have preferred, precisely one suspects, for reasons of greater resiliency, to rely much more for anti-missile tracking on ground-based radar systems, which have far greater resiliency, or so it would seem, than satellites do. So that's an article from National Review, which perhaps we can take with a heavy pinch of salt. It ends with demands that the US Air Force should invest even more in protecting its satellites. It doesn't quite explain how that can be done, but it would seem that, this is partly an article that seems to be intended to encourage more spending on new and more advanced weapon systems in space, but that doesn't mean that some of the points it's making aren't valid. Anyway, So much for space developments. The other area, which is of course interesting, is, as I said, with this development of the S-550 missile system. And as I said, it appears to be, or at least we're told, that it is designed to deal with intercontinental ballistic missiles. In other words, missiles launched from the United States. And we've seen that one Russian commentator, military commentator, sees it as a replacement or a potential follow-on to the existing A235 Nudol system, which is now being deployed around Moscow and which is intended to provide Russia with anti-ballistic missile defense. I'm going to give my own guess here that the fact that, unlike the Nudol, the S-550 is apparently going to be a mobile system, what that points to is that its primary purpose is to provide a second-tier defense for any warheads that penetrate the shield provided by the Nudol. So the idea, presumably, would be to use systems like the Nudol and perhaps the S-500 to try and shoot down intercontinental ballistic missiles at very high altitudes, perhaps near space altitudes, and then any other systems that penetrate, they would be countered, or at least that would be the hope, by the shorter range S-550 systems, which would be road mobile, enabling them to be deployed in many places and to be moved around as a crisis arose. Note that we are told that this is going to be a hypersonic system. Of course, all of these systems are hypersonic to a great extent, but the stress on this suggests that this is an extremely high acceleration missile indeed, which again suggests that it's going to be, if you like, a kind of point defense system, one to deal with any warheads that penetrate the shield that already provided by the Nudol. So I think it could be, possibly, that this is intended to supplement the Nudol rather than to replace it. In other words, to provide Russia with a layered anti-missile defense and also to make that anti-ballistic missile defense denser than what we have at the moment, with just one system, the Nudol, supplemented to some extent by the S-500. So a whole cascade of different weapons, all of them apparently with different roles, all of them threatening various US capabilities, some of them threatening the position of the United States in space, others providing Russia with anti-ballistic missile capabilities which match or which the Russians claim surpass those of the United States. And these are going to be road mobile systems. American anti-ballistic missile interceptors so far are not road mobile. And perhaps most alarmingly of all, the Russians are already talking about their willingness to export some of these systems. Russia already says that it's prepared to export the S-500 to India. Almost certainly they would be prepared to export it to China as well. And perhaps at some point they will be exporting the S-550 also. And who knows what other systems they might decide to export as well, and what other kind of technology transfer arrangements between the Chinese and the Russians are already taking place. Now, I am going to make here a number of further points, which is that I think it's almost certainly true that Russia and China perhaps even more, could make the whole space situation for the United States critically dangerous. I think that those American satellites are clearly becoming more vulnerable. I know for a fact that the Russians are able to track pretty much the location of pretty much every American satellite in space. They've even grumbled, by the way, recently that Elon Musk's plan to install scores of additional satellites in space is probably an American plot to try to swamp their satellite tracking capabilities. But apparently they do have advanced satellite tracking capabilities, and they anticipate, I'm sure, that they will be able to keep on top of everything that the US does and which Elon Musk does in terms of putting large numbers of satellites in space. And I'm sure that what the Russians do, the Chinese can also do. The Chinese undoubtedly have an anti-satellite capability in terms of their missile systems, their ability to destroy American satellites in space. They undoubtedly have one which I suspect is at least comparable sophistication to that of Russia. So the Russians and the Chinese are able to take significant steps to counter US space capabilities. Undoubtedly, creating a war in space would cause disruptions, severe disruptions to Russian and Chinese warfighting capabilities and to their economies. However, as we see with these radar anti-early warning systems, the Russians and the Chinese probably do have, as that national review article said, greater resilience in this field than the US does. That they have probably less reliance on satellites than the US do. So, yes, they have probably a real capability to counter the US in space, to wage an effective war in space, to deny space or the use of space to the US, and doing so would indeed degrade US military capabilities, perhaps by a critical degree, whilst degrading Russian and Chinese capabilities probably to a significantly less degree. When it comes to anti-ballistic missile capabilities, here, of course, the issue is much more problematic, because I know that there is a fairly widespread view within the scientific community that all of these anti-ballistic missile systems, the S-550, the S-500, the A235 Nudol, these are the Russian systems, and of course the American systems, the THAAD and the Aegis onshore, that none of these systems really work, and that they wouldn't actually be especially effective in a military situation. Some missiles, some nuclear missiles, some nuclear warheads would get through, perhaps most of them would, and that these are very costly systems that don't achieve or come close to achieving what they are claimed to do. But I am going to say that the Russian calculus might be, again, rather more sophisticated, because the Russians, as I said before, have been pressing very hard, and so have the Chinese, by the way, the Americans, to agree a treaty on the use of space and on the limits of the use of space in war. And the United States has been consistently resisting doing so. And of course, the United States also pulled out in the early 2000s from the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, something which the Russians have always strongly complained about, and which the Russians say was a major step destabilizing the whole arms control system, making it extremely difficult and unstable, and creating a potential situation where both the Russians and the Chinese now have to worry about American anti-ballistic missile defenses countering the effectiveness of their own strategic deterrent forces, obliging both the Chinese and the Russians to develop their own strategic defense forces, and as we've seen also, the Russians to develop their own anti-ballistic missile defenses. Now, this is where it all begins to become very interesting, because, of course, the US decision to pull out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty in the early 2000s, and the US refusal to go down the route of a space treaty, a treaty regulating the way in which space is used in warfighting situations, is profoundly connected. And it originates from a famous speech that the then US President Ronald Reagan made in 1983. Ronald Reagan talked at that time about creating an anti-ballistic missile system in space, a space-based system to shoot down intercontinental ballistic missiles launched, as it would then have been, from the Soviet Union towards the United States, using new technologies and new physical principles. And it's fair to say that the overwhelming majority of scientists have been profoundly skeptical about such a system, the possibilities of such a system, but the idea of it in the United States, at least amongst some people, has never fully gone away. I've always got the impression that the underlying reason why the US has been so unwilling to agree to any treaty restricting use of space in military terms is because deep down there are some people in the Pentagon, and especially perhaps in Congress, more perhaps on the Republican side than the Democrat, who still hanker for this idea that at some point technology will evolve to the level where the United States is finally able to deploy that space-based anti-ballistic missile system that Ronald Reagan spoke about in that speech long ago, way back in 1983. I repeatedly come across articles in various American think tank websites and such places, and in news sites like the National Interest, for example, where you come across various people from various think tanks continuously advocating development of a space-based intercontinental ballistic missile system. And this mirage, because that is what it is, has, in my opinion, been the major factor which has not only prevented the United States from agreeing to a treaty limiting the use of space in military terms, it's also been what has driven many American actions, specifically with anti-ballistic missile technologies. The United States pulled out of the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty in the early 2000s during the time of the George W. Bush administration. The plans that it came up with to develop anti-ballistic missile systems in Europe and its deployment of such systems in various places are generally acknowledged by most people to be ineffectual in defense terms. But deploying these systems has enabled the United States in Europe to create the infrastructure to deploy ground-based missiles, cruise missiles, and perhaps other types of missiles which could be launched at Russian territory, in other words, surface-to-surface missiles, but it's also provided the United States with that window for one day developing this space-based anti-ballistic missile system, which remains this tantalizing dream, which, in my opinion, clouds the thinking of many American strategic thinkers. Now, what I suspect the Russians are doing, and I suspect that the Chinese are not far behind, they might even be ahead, is that they are producing all of these systems like the Nudol, the S-500, at least in its anti-ballistic missile and anti-space capabilities, and of course the S-550 and the Peresvet laser system, in order to put pressure on the United States to revise its thinking on these issues, to realize that in fact it is the United States that is at greater vulnerability in terms of an arms race in space and in anti-ballistic missile technologies than its peer opponents, China and Russia. And I think that the Russian plan is not to try to deny space to the United States, because, of course, as I've said, doing that would be very disruptive for Russia as well. I think the plan is to force the United States to the negotiating table where it would finally agree and accept limits on anti-ballistic missile and space-based systems. Now, if we go back to what happened at the time when the anti-ballistic missile treaty was negotiated, one of the key drivers behind that treaty was US alarm about the first generation Soviet anti-ballistic missile system, which was at that time being developed by the Soviets in the 1960s and which was being deployed by the Soviets around Moscow. And there was a famous summit meeting in the US town of Glassboro between the then US President Lyndon Johnson and the Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin, in which it's known that Johnson pressed Kosygin very hard to agree to a treaty on anti-ballistic missiles, on limiting anti-ballistic missile systems. And there's been accounts of this meeting which say that Kosygin was left almost speechless with anger at the pressure the US was putting him and the Soviet Union to agree to these limitations. But eventually the Soviet Politburo came round, and that was how the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty came about. In other words, it came about as a result of an American initiative alarmed by Soviet anti-ballistic missile developments, which not only matched or appeared to match those which the United States was taking in this same technology, but which also looked as if they might compromise the effectiveness of US deterrent forces. And it's hardly inconceivable that the extremely historically minded government in Moscow remembers this episode from the 1960s and are saying to themselves that just as it was Soviet anti-ballistic missile deployments and developments in the 1960s, which eventually led to the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. So it is Russian space and anti-ballistic missile developments today which will force the United States to the negotiating table to agree a treaty again. After all, as that article in National Review says, the US military depends far more on space for its in order to operate than its peer opponents do. So, in a sense, it is strongly in the US interest to agree to such a treaty, just as it was in the US interest in the 1960s to agree to the original 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Now, we know that the Russians and the Americans are currently talking about something which is called strategic stability. These are very, very secret negotiations. We know that they began at the time of shortly after the Biden-Putin Geneva summit meeting. We know that they're very tentative, that they're not actually at the moment producing any breakthroughs or going very far. Indeed, the Americans are complicating issues by trying to get the Russians to agree to counting Chinese systems alongside their own in these negotiations, something which the Russians categorically refuse to do. But it's possible that as these anti-satellite, anti-space systems, and as these anti-ballistic missile systems start to appear in Russia, they will become the topic of these strategic stability talks, and that could in time lead the United States to shift from its current position and to agree to talks with Russia to try to negotiate some kind of agreement in this field. And this is one area where I think the Chinese would probably agree to join, because from a Chinese point of view, demilitarizing space, or at least limiting the extent to which space could be used in a warfighting role, especially in terms of strategic forces, and also limiting the way in which limiting this proliferation of anti-ballistic missile systems, especially given that China has a much smaller strategic deterrent force than either the United States or Russia do. These kind of limits would serve Chinese interests as well. They would not, in effect, prevent China from continuing to develop its own strategic deterrent capability, but they would mean that China would not have to worry about possible threats from anti-ballistic missile systems developed by the United States to the same extent. And of course, this phantom fear of this American space-based anti-ballistic missile system, well, that would be allayed entirely. Anyway, we shall see whether I am right. We shall see whether all these moves that the Russians are making do achieve that effect. I suspect in time that they will. We already see the alarm that some people in the United States are showing as the Russians increasingly display their tremendous capabilities in this field. And I suspect that before very long, the United States will do exactly what the Russians want and what the Chinese want, and come to the table and negotiate in earnest, both on a treaty on space and perhaps either limits or perhaps the entire abolition of anti-ballistic missile systems. Anyway, we will see how things turn out, but I've no doubt at all that these particular demonstrations that the Russians have made, which are, as I said, of a highly public nature, are ultimately intended for that specific effect. I would say that they also have, of course, the secondary effect. One of the problems with the 1972 treaty is that the United States felt that there would be no consequences if it pulled out of it, given that the Russians don't trust the Americans an inch. Their ability to show to the Americans that if the Americans do the same again, the Russians can match them system for system and perhaps even exceed US capabilities in some respects, that will be give a major incentive to the United States to abide by whatever treaty is eventually negotiated. Well, as I said, we will see whether all this is correct. We will see whether this all does lead to negotiations. I suspect it will, and I suspect that the administration will have to make, the US administration or any future administration will be obliged to negotiate in earnest, no longer from that position of strength, which is the one that the United States always seeks in any negotiation to achieve. Thank you for joining me again today for this program. I look forward to you joining me again soon in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran. Please also remember to check us out on our other platforms, first and foremost Locals, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, and where we publish lots of exclusive content, and where I'm also increasingly doing live streams. Now, you can catch up with my live streams on Locals. They now regularly appear on Wednesday at 1900 hours EST. I would add that you can just join and become a member of Locals and listen to what I say. If you want to participate, and you're very welcome to, well, for $5, you can become an active member for a month, and that will enable you to participate in and put questions directly to me. But that's up to you. You can come on Locals. You don't have to do that. You can listen and participate, or if you want to become more involved, well, you're very welcome to as well. In addition, we are also obviously on other platforms, on BitChute, Library, Rumble, ODYSEE, and of course the new free speech platform, SuperU. And you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also by coming to our shop on this on this Thanksgiving weekend. You'll see that I have my famous magic mug with the US flag there. And of course, there's also t-shirts, sweatshirts, hats, hoodies, and other amazing things in our shop too. If you can I also ask you, please, to check your subscription to this channel, and also to tick the like button to this video if you've liked this program. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.